welcome to today's edition of the Full Scottish on Broadcasting Scotland. I'm Ruth Watson. My guests today are Maureen Watt, former SNP MSP for Aberdeen South and North Kincardine, and financial economist Frances Coppola, who also is a professional opera singer, so a woman of many erts and perts. Hello, thank you very much for joining us today. Well, we've got a full programme ahead. I'll go through the Ukraine update first, and then we'll come back to you for your thoughts on the news happening at home and around the world. The Ukraine update on day 655 of Russia's war in Ukraine. Ukraine has condemned Russian plans to hold presidential elections next spring on occupied Ukrainian territory, declaring them null and void and pledging to prosecute any observers sent to monitor them. This week, Russia's upper house set the country's presidential election for next March, and Chair Valentina Matviyenko said residents in 4 occupied Ukrainian regions would be able to vote for the first time. Ukraine's foreign ministry said, "We call on the international community to resolutely condemn Russia's intention to hold presidential elections in the occupied Ukrainian territories and to impose sanctions on those involved in their organization and conduct." Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was traveling to the inauguration of Argentina's president-elect Javier Milei. Zelensky congratulated Milei, a far-right populist who has challenged Argentina's political establishment, on his victory, and both leaders spoke on the phone soon after Milei's election. Ukraine's First Lady, Olena Zelenska, has warned that Ukrainians were in mortal danger of being left to die if Western countries did not continue their financial support. Ms. Zelenska made the remarks a day after Republican senators in the US blocked a key aid bill that would have provided more than $60 billion worth of support to Ukraine. The Polish government denied reports that the delivery of military equipment to Ukraine was being hindered by protesting Polish truckers blockading the border. "I categorically deny that such a situation occurred," said Polish Vice Minister of National Defence Marcin Osiepa. Military convoys across the border are convoys escorted by military police. Avdiivka, the eastern Ukrainian town that has seen some of the most intense fighting of the war, is on the verge of imminent collapse to Russian forces, according to a report in the Times. The report says that Ukrainian troops defending the front line are being starved of ammunition and hamstrung in their attempts to repel the advancing enemy soldiers. Olympic chiefs have been criticised for allowing Russia and Belarusian athletes to compete next year as neutrals outside team events, and if they do not actively support the invasion. The Finnish Supreme Court has blocked the extradition to Ukraine of Jan Petrovsky, a Russian neo-Nazi group leader who fought in Ukraine, warning of the risk that he could be susceptible to inhuman treatment, which is precluded under the European Convention on Human Rights. Well, that's the news from Ukraine. Going on to other international conflict. It's hardly conflict, is it? I mean, in Gaza, it's not exactly a two-way fight. At the United Nations Security Council on Friday, the United States vetoed the Secretary-General's Article 99 intervention, which called for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. The UK abstained. Israeli newspaper Haaretz reports that 61% of Gaza deaths from airstrikes are civilians, a higher proportion than in all world conflicts in the 20th century. There's a humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. Is Israel free to break international law with impunity? Frances, what is your perspective on what we're seeing in Gaza and from the United Nations this week?
Well, as far as I can see, while Israel continues to be backed militarily and economically by the United States, it does in fact have impunity to do whatever it pleases. Not only in Gaza, but we should also remember on the West Bank, where Israel is conducting what was a guerrilla war against Palestinians and is now moving into a full-scale invasion, all of it undercover and with the excuse of the supposed support of West Bank Palestinians for Hamas in Gaza. So Israel is already fighting a war on two fronts. And it is also increasingly threatening Lebanon as well, because Hezbollah is sitting on its border and every now and then firing rockets at it. So the chances of this war escalating into something much bigger are rising, I would say, the longer that the US continues to back what Israel is doing in Gaza, and the more angry the rest of the world becomes about what is going on in Gaza.
It's a stunning situation that we find ourselves in, isn't it, Maureen? I mean, um, the United Nations, only the United States opposed the very unusual call for action from Antonio Guterres of the United Nations, and the United Kingdom abstained. I mean, where does this put the United States and the United Kingdom in terms of international diplomacy on the world stage, and um, and in terms of the way in which the wider world and Middle East views the parallel? We look at the outrage happening in Ukraine, and quite rightly, at what Russia is doing, and yet Israel is doing worse, and the United States and the UK are silent.
Yes, I think as Francis says, it is really a very worrying situation. I think we need to look at this on two levels. Firstly, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, where clearly now nowhere in Gaza is safe for its citizens, and they're being pushed further and further out of the cities, out of towns, and literally onto the desert sands and towards the coast. Goodness knows where it will end up. And clearly, there's not enough aid getting in, and people are starving, and the civilians have paid a very, very heavy price. On an international level, as you say, it really is very difficult. You could look at it as the part of the world ganging up against the West, the USA and the UK. And the fact that Putin has been to visit Arab countries, I think, is very worrying, and could be seen as plotting against Western civilization. So you can see from that point of view why the US is continuing to fully back Israel, notwithstanding its long links and support and aid for Israel. In terms of the United Nations, I think the United Nations is in a very difficult position. Clearly, it has had, through its agencies, a long-standing presence in Gaza, and therefore finds itself in a very difficult position. But it's really important that organisations like the UN continue to have influence and power backed by its member states in the world.
And there could be little doubt that, as you say, as you indicated, I mean, Putin is in complete cahoots behind this. It was said that the Hamas leaders met Putin before October the 7th and the atrocities that happened in Israel then. Syria has increased its attacks on Idlib. Iran obviously is facing huge domestic issues as women's rights and freedoms protests continue in the face of extreme brutality there. And of course, Putin's hoping for a deflection away from the world attention, away from his atrocities in Ukraine. But that doesn't get away from the fact that we're witnessing what seems to be very clearly ethnic cleansing and genocide of the Palestinian people in Gaza and increasingly in the West Bank. So at what point do you think that the international community will look at war crimes? I mean, Netanyahu's in a difficult situation politically, domestically anyway, with corruption charges against him. There are growing protests in Israel against his far-right coalition government, who have been using the most appalling language about eradicating subhuman Palestinians and calling to bury them all under the sand. And I mean, really, and they're not even hiding it. So from a moral standpoint, how can we stand by and do nothing? And if we stand by, if we don't want to do nothing, what can we do, Francis?
I suppose Israel would say, but yes, but look, just look at how we got here. Look what Hamas did, And the official position of the United States is still, look what Hamas did, Hamas must be eradicated. Now, the voices that are saying, yes, but you can't do that militarily, are, I think, growing louder. There are some very respected voices with long histories in military conflicts of this kind saying that now you can't eliminate Hamas militarily. It has to be a political solution. And therefore, for that, we need a ceasefire and we need both parties to come to the table and negotiate. And we need to work towards a two-state solution. We aren't there yet. But for me, that's where it has to go, and the sooner the better. And I would like to see a lot more pressure from the international community on Israel to agree to a ceasefire and start negotiations. It's hard when you feel you're the wronged party, and Israel very much feels it is. But from the Palestinian side, they're going to say, "Yeah, look what's happened to us over the last 75 years." And the fact that Israel has what it calls mown the grass, which means gone and killed a few thousand Palestinians about once every 2 or 3 years for the last 20. Both sides feel they've been wronged, but actually that kind of persistent grievance and persistent victimhood is not a good place from which to actually do the hard negotiating that's needed to agree a long-term peaceful solution.
I mean, Maureen, we've got significant evidence that Israel's IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, and the Israeli government was warned well in advance in quite detail about the Hamas attacks. There was a former Israeli government minister on the Christian Amanpour program, I think it's on CNN, who was explaining that the tunnels that Hamas use in Israel, in Palestine, were actually dug by Israel. So, I mean, how complicit is Israel in this? And it could be interpreted as the far right government has been looking for an excuse to go in and clear the Palestinians out of Gaza and now the West Bank before a two-state solution can be imposed upon them.
I don't feel I'm able to comment on whether the Israelis have helped the Palestinians and Hamas dig the tunnels. I haven't heard enough evidence on that. But clearly, as you both have said, Netanyahu is an extremely right-wing leader of Israel and doesn't have universal support in what he's doing from the Israelis. So there must come a time when even the United States can see that pretty much the rest of the world is against what Israel, the complete slaughter of Palestinians that is happening at the moment. And I thought, we haven't heard much from him this week, but previously Antony Blinken was beginning to take that view. So at what point the US says, right, Israel, enough is enough, I don't know when that's going to happen, but that clearly has to happen in order to get the fighting to stop and to get people around the negotiating table. Because as we know, it's jaw, not war that brings about peaceful solutions.
Well, sadly for the innocents of Gaza, it looks like we're some distance away from that, and yet, it's. I mean, looking at the economics of it, Francis, there are a few analysts who are saying that we're actually in these dark and absolutely dismal, grisly, brutal days of oppression that were very similar to those that preceded the fall of the fall at the end of apartheid in South Africa, and that actually there's sort of like there's a social tipping point happening, perhaps within Israel, because they're seeing appalling injuries coming, their soldiers coming back with appalling injuries, and also there is some awareness of what is happening. And do you think that? I mean, I noticed that there's talk that Starbucks has there's a boycott against Starbucks happening in parts of America that's apparently costing them a significant amount of money. And do you think that there will come a point where the tipping point happens because general people are saying, no, we've had enough?
I don't think that's going to come from within Israel, actually, sadly. Everything I've heard from journalists working on the ground is that, if you've been listening to Sky News, for example, they're saying that what they're hearing from Israelis is that they want all of this and more. They want the slaughter. They want Palestinians to be eliminated, essentially, and that is a very strongly held view in Israeli society at the moment. So I'm not convinced that replacing Netanyahu would necessarily mean having a government that was any more friendly to Palestinians. But I think external pressure. We're beginning to see that with the protests and with the sanctions, the informal sanctions by companies, may begin to bring to bear pressure on countries like the US to say enough is enough, we will not support this anymore. Ultimately, it has to be the cessation of military aid to Israel. That would end the war because Israel would not be able to continue it. And if it shows any signs at all of escalating into, say, Lebanon or heaven preserve us, Iran, then clearly something like that will have to happen, because we can't have Israel blowing up the entire Middle East.
I mean, Maureen, there were protests outside on the West Coast. There were protests outside a factory that sort of produces parts or munitions, I'm not quite sure which, that were destined for Israel. I mean, is this kind of people power the kind of way in which Scots can stand up and say there are demonstrations happening across Scotland, in particular, I think every Saturday in Glasgow, as Keir Starmer found out. But is this kind of people power the way in which Scots can stand up and say no? And should the Scottish government be intervening in some way to say that they don't want companies to be sending munitions? I mean, if we were an independent country, obviously we could do that, but under the current constitutional framework, what can the Scottish government do? And if the Scottish government can't do anything, what should the Scottish people, or could the Scottish people, be doing?
Well, firstly, defence and arms obviously is not devolved, it's retained at Westminster. I think the First Minister has taken from the beginning of this conflict a very measured and proper stance, in that he's called for a ceasefire right from the beginning. In terms of protests, normally you would think that governments might react to hundreds of thousands of people marching on the streets every single weekend. But this government seems oblivious to taking into account public opinion when it carries out things either internally or internationally as a government, and clearly is not interested in listening to its citizens, but only listening to the very far right of its own party. So, I don't think we're in a normal situation, whatever a normal situation once was. And it won't, in my view, change in the UK until we have a general election.
And yet, I mean, obviously, it's we're looking at the people of Gaza and what's happening there. But I mean, looking at it domestically here, would Labour be doing anything differently? I mean, it just seems like Keir Starmer is sort of like a strange shadow puppet of Rishi Sunak. It's very odd. I mean, Francis, do you have any perspective on the different sides and this kind of confusing stance? Anna Sarwar says, oh no, he's all for a ceasefire, and yet the two Scottish MPs for Labour follow Keir Starmer's line. They don't listen to Anna Sarwar. So, I mean, would there be any difference under Labour?
It's hard to say. I mean, clearly at the moment, Labour is not supporting a ceasefire. But I don't know if you've read David Lammy's article in The Observer. It's saying,
I saw the headline, yeah.
Yeah, I've actually read the article, because he is saying that Labour would take action against in the other war that Israel is fighting on the West Bank. And actually, I know that the carnage in Gaza is dominating the headlines. Actually, what is going on in the West Bank is at least as important. And taking action on that, strong action on that, is really important. So that is a little bit of a move on Labour's part. It's not enough yet. They've also said that they will. Labour he's also said that Labour will resist any moves to evict Palestinians from Gaza, and that's, I think, an important red line, because the members of the Israeli government have made it quite clear that kicking Palestinians out of Gaza is exactly what they want to do, and they're trying to the reason for squeezing Palestinians into an ever smaller area with less and less means of survival is about pressurizing the world to accept Palestinian Gazans as refugees.
Yeah, I mean,
So
I hear
think
that. I hear that they're
yeah.
now flooding the aquifers with salt water. I suppose none of this has got anything to do with all the gas reserves that have just been found off the Gaza, the
Well,
Palestinian.
we'll come on to this when we talk about COP28, but I think actually it has quite a bit to do with the gas reserves.
Well, it links us beautifully to the next story. So COP28 opened with an agreement on compensation for loss and damage. With will it be able to agree to phase out fossil fuels, or the oil-producing nations block progress to 1.5 degrees centigrade? I mean, there's a very good book. I forget the title of it now, but it basically says it came out in 2008 or 2009, and it was basically about how you can chart the direction of where the next wars are going to be from the planned pipelines. And that was very much the case with the Syrian conflict. There was a sort of a pipeline going from the Middle East up that was either going to go through potentially Crimea or Syria, or would it be, so as you said, I mean, how much, when we're looking at the fossil fuel industry, it's very hard to see it without sort of the blood dripping off people's hands. I mean, it's quite a, we all rely on it. We all have few choices, but it's a pretty dirty, murky business, whether you're looking at the murder of Ken Saro-Wiwa in the Agoni lands, or whether you're looking at the absolute misery of people who I forget the place in South America, where they basically live by a toxic dump left of what had been their water courses by a prominent oil company, which I won't mention because it's now gone bust. But I mean, it's not only are we looking at our entire planet burning around us and perhaps becoming unlivable, but we're kind of being gaslit while we're doing it, because the people now running COP28 are, I mean, like, basically the foxes have been put in charge of the hen house. Am I being cynical, Frances?
No, I don't think you are. I think even the decision to hold COP28 in an oil producing country, and for the chairman to be the chairman of the state owned oil company, it was quite extraordinary. It almost feels like, the world is kind of paying lip service to the idea of phasing out fossil fuels, and then dragging its heat massively on doing it, and expecting all the running to be done by countries that actually don't use them that much. And there's also evidently now a bit of a scramble for control of gas, which is seen as an intermediate stage. The US sees this particularly as an intermediate stage to moving away from fossil fuels. They have this idea that gas somehow isn't quite a fossil fuel, when of course it is. And that's why the Gaza gas reserves are really important, because I don't think it's any accident that it was in July that Israel was busy agreeing terms for exploitation of the Gazan gas fields, the offshore gas fields, and the revenues from which properly belong to the Gazan Palestinians. And if they were properly exploited, actually would mean that Gaza would be self-sufficient in energy, which is the last thing that Israel wants. So I actually think that this kind of control of resources is not just about land, it's also about other resources. We're seeing in several, and I want to flag something else as well, which is that, yes, the oil business is a dirty business, the gas business is an equally dirty business and fraught with political risk. But as we move away from fossil fuels towards minerals and metals, we're going to see increasingly dirty scrambles for those materials as well. I mean, there is already more war in the Congo, which is the only place where they mine cobalt.
I mean, it's one of those things where, sort of in particular at the moment, the Chinese hand stretches quite far because I mean, sort of China has been planning, they're sort of playing a long game, and I mean, sort of providing a lot of resources to countries across the African continent in terms of road building and infrastructure. Um, but a lot of people on the African continent now are beginning to view this as a kind of a new form of kind of fiscal colonialism, sort of because it's sort of the deals that are being struck for these roads and this infrastructure basically means that they're going to extract all the mineral wealth. And of course, we're seeing some of this in um, other nations sort of, that China has a presence in where there are resources. And of course, Rwanda, there's thought that some of the potential destabilization going on around that border is because Rwanda is so mineral rich. And then you've got people talking about mining meteors to get minerals. I mean, just how complicit are we in our own destruction? Maureen, do you have any optimistic sort of perspectives on? I mean, do we just need to stop trying to? Do we just need to stop talking about a growth economy? I mean, and start looking at actually, let's just make do and mend.
Ooh, well, there's an awful lot to unpick in that. Firstly, in terms of COP28, I think COP seems to be increasingly taken over by oil and gas companies. We've seen them having a huge presence at COP28, and as you said, having COP in an oil producing nation just simply sends out the wrong message. And I'm sure NGOs attending have been, completely frustrated with what's happening. Clearly, we are going to need gas, particularly for quite somewhat time while we transition away from oil and gas. And I don't think there's any need to be burning oil, and we can be moving away from oil. On the geopolitics of all this, it's really very interesting as to how wars tend to be over resources. And I'm particularly interested in what you said about China, because I've seen that at firsthand in Malawi, where the Chinese have built the Parliament building quite a number of years ago now. We've got China's influence, and it is about the bigger, richer countries still exploiting the less well off. And that's why you see the desperate pleas from smaller countries at COP saying we're the ones being affected mostly by climate change. So yes, I do think that we need to realize that growth is not the measure of wealth anymore. And Scotland is making moves towards a more well-being economy. But we need more countries to be seeing a move towards that, and not this all-out dash for growth, which means depleting the world's resources. And if we could rely on countries using their resources and being paid for the resources for the benefit of their nations, all of their nation, rather than being siphoned off by corrupt politicians, I'm sure we would, have a much better international well-being economy rather than what we have at the moment.
I mean, Francis, it's very easy for us to go, oh, look at what China's doing. But we get most of our stuff from China. So, I mean, isn't China just acting on our behalf? How much responsibility do we as individuals? If I go out and buy myself some nice new stuff, that's probably coming from China. China's got to get it from somewhere, and I'm as much of the problem as China is. I mean, shouldn't I just be going out and sort of whittling myself a new wooden spoon or something rather than buying something nice and shiny? What can we do within a world that has an economy that is constructed on consuming?
Um, it's really quite problematic. I mean, interesting, we've been talking about oil, but actually the bigger problem, even now, is still coal, where we haven't managed to get rid of coal, and it is extensively used for all sorts of things. I think individually we can try and be aware of where the things we buy come from, and try and have an idea of how carbon efficient they are. But this idea that we can somehow manage without growth in a country where we haven't solved our inequality problems is just going to be poverty for loads of people. So we have to look at the whole way in which our economy works. I mean, all the green agendas, the Green New Deals, and so forth have always been about social reform and fiscal reform and redistribution of wealth, as much as about pivoting away from fossil fuels, because we cannot pivot away from growth. If pivoting away from growth means that a lot of people are going to end up in severe poverty. We should also remember, I think, that much of the world is poorer than we are, and we still, as a world, maybe should be aware that there are a lot of people who are living in abject poverty, much poorer than even the poorest in our country. And should we really abandon them for the sake of reducing our own fossil fuel footprint? I mean, there is a moral question there, which I think is quite unanswerable for me.
I could always say tax the rich and get the billionaires to pay their share, but I'm sure it is ironic, isn't it, that 2 or 3 billionaires could probably sort out the entire world's problems, and yet choose not to. It's a strange psychology. Moving on to strange psychology, Boris Johnson gave evidence to the United Kingdom's COVID inquiry this week. Did we find out any more from him, or did it just confirm the chaos at the heart of the UK government? He did say they believed COVID might die out like SARS before reaching the UK. Was this his justification for lack of preparation, or was it just haver? I mean, I don't know how much of the COVID inquiry you guys were able to stomach. It's been the interrogations from the various King's Councils has been extremely good. I mean, there's been some very probing questions, but do you think any of us really got any of the answers? And how likely do you think that there's going to be a robust judgment given at the end of this? Maureen, what's your take on what we've seen so far from the COVID inquiry?
Well, if we're talking about the UK inquiry, we've got to remember that there's one ongoing in Scotland, and it's taking a completely different tack to the one or approach to the one at the UK level. I mean, most of this week obviously has been dominated by the evidence given by Boris Johnson. It's difficult probably for some people to hear this, but clearly in dealing with this, he was completely out of his depth. Not just that he couldn't understand maths and science, but was incapable of taking decisions. And, the fact that he took so long to make the decision to lock down clearly had a devastating effect on the spread of COVID initially. And also, as we'll probably see this week, the Eat Out to Help Out scheme contributed to further deaths and further spread. Did we learn anything new? Probably not, because a lot had been leaked prior to Johnson's appearance. And of course, we'd heard from other people about how they thought he'd handle it. Did I think that Boris Johnson was contrite? No. Did I think he was trying to salvage his reputation? Yes. Clearly was affected by the fact that he'd had COVID himself, but did that make him subsequently take the measures needed? No. So yes, it'll be interesting to see what Sunak's take is and his evidence is this coming week.
I mean, Francis, the prioritizing of the economy over people's well-being. I mean, the likes of Cheltenham being allowed to go ahead when clearly there should have been a lockdown in advance. The Eat Out to Help Out scheme, which I don't think I met anybody up here that thought that was a good idea. I mean, we're all kind of sitting there listening to our First Minister telling us to be cautious, and then suddenly we're being asked to go out and breathe on each other in packed restaurants, and it just seemed absolutely bonkers. But I mean, how much of this is because they looked at the economy, they looked at the amount of empty office space and landlords potentially losing money and revenue not coming in, and they thought, oh gosh, we better do something to kickstart it, rather than looking at people's well-being? Or is that fair? Were they right to try and save the economy?
No, I've always felt that they mistakenly prioritised certain aspects of the economy. It wasn't even the whole economy, over saving lives, in effect. So the worries about commercial real estate, for example, drove a premature return to offices and really a lot of pressure on firms and the civil service and so forth to bring people back into the office against their will. But then it's a Conservative government. What were you expecting? Perhaps if it had been further to the left, there might have been a greater priority of lives over the economy. And that often is the distinction between the left in politics and the right in politics. The left tends to prioritise human lives, and the right tends to prioritise the economy. And they just demonstrated that in spades. They left it to the last possible minute before locking down, and they had lots of big events that they wanted to go ahead that they didn't want to disrupt, and so on. And they allowed people to die because of it.
I mean, how painful must it be, one wonders, for those who lost family and friends to be watching this evidence and to be hearing. I mean, I thought that the various King's Councils, in particular, there was a gentleman who was probing on behalf of the Black and ethnic minority families about the deaths there, pointing out that the first, I think, 20 doctors to die were ethnic minority doctors, and did this cause Johnson any alarm? And it was fairly clear to me from the evidence that Johnson hadn't even thought about it. I mean, it's how much does this tell us about the importance of a probing judiciary, and that despite all that the Tories seem to be trying to rally sort of enemies of the people rhetoric, that we do maintain a robust and independent sort of legal process? I mean, Maureen, what's your take on the importance of this process for justice and the truth to come out?
I think it's crucially important, and more so for the people who lost loved ones during the pandemic. They have got to see that justice has been done. I think the coverage in the mainstream media has been trying to rubbish the inquiry, the UK inquiry, and saying that it's the questioning is always trying to, get that gotcha moment, rather than probing as to what mistakes were made and what could be changed. I think, if you look at the overall picture and look at it from the point of view of the judge sitting there, I'm sure she will be able to pick out the gotcha moments from getting at the real nuts and bolts of what went on. But it's absolutely crucial that justice for the bereaved is seen to be done totally. And not only that, of course, that we learn lessons and are in a state of preparedness for any future pandemic, which is more likely to come before another 100 years than not.
But I mean, there was a preparedness committee which the Tories disbanded 3 or 4 years before COVID hit. I mean, if you follow, there's a Professor Lucy Easthope and others. I mean, she's a remarkable person. If you ever get the chance to read what she's written, she's got a very good book out, When the Dust Settles. But you know, she makes very clear in her correspondence on social media that the disaster planners had a plan. You know, all of this had been discussed, was in place, and then the unit was disbanded before. Not long before the pandemic hit, but they all knew it was coming and the advice was there. But I mean, briefly, before we move on to the next story, which links
Well, can
very
I
well
just say
onto
on
this
that?
issue of yes.
Sorry, can I just say on that? So I, as Minister for Public Health, I was involved in planning for Ebola. And I remember it clearly because the scenario planning was that somebody would come to Scotland from who had been out in Africa treating Ebola and would take it with them. And it was happening on Hogmanay. And actually, the outbreak, I think, was a couple of days before Christmas, if I can recall properly. So there is planning goes on. In terms of this type of planning, I remember that there were umpteen occasions where civil servants tried to get all the administrations together to do planning on this, and it kept being postponed mainly by the UK government, and eventually it went ahead with civil servants only during one, I think, recall Easter recess. So it was then thereafter, of course, that the unit was disbanded. And I remember clearly asking if we needed to keep so much PPE in storage, and I was slapped down by civil servants, rightly so, telling me, of course we do, Minister. So this planning does go on, but the fact that the unit was disbanded clearly had a devastating effect.
And briefly, before we move on to the Rwanda bill story, where can people see the Scottish COVID inquiry? Because, of course, there's nothing about that on Scottish news or the UK news. Where can people find that if they're interested in seeing the evidence?
Well,
Maureen, you were
apart from some media outlets, some newspapers have journalists covering it. I'm sure I read in a quick glance at the papers today that I think it was at the Herald, I think, had someone covering it. But yeah, it's not getting the prominence that it should. Perhaps it will when politicians start appearing in front of it. At the moment, they're taking evidence from families, aren't they?
I will look further into it. I have to say that the fairies in my ear are telling me it's at the website covidinquiry19.scot. COVID-19 inquiry.scot. So we should all scurry off and look it up after this programme. So, I mean, moving on to the Rwanda bill, can you possibly say that black is white? To saying that Rwanda is a safe country, make it so. What is driving the UK obsession with immigration to a degree that it has blocked all safe and legal routes to the UK for refugees in an absolutely staggering sort of trouncing of sort of international conventions and norms. I mean, we were talking a few minutes ago about the importance of an independent judiciary and, you know, sort of the legal process being allowed to run its course and be independent of government interference. And yet here we have Rishi Sunak and the ruling Conservative Party in London saying that they're going to tell the lawyers what to say, that they're going to tell the courts what to say. Labour are saying, yeah, we like some of what you're saying here. We probably would go along with this too. I mean, this is pretty dark stuff for democracy, surely, if the Supreme Court, the highest court in the British Isles, Rishi Sunak's going to go, yeah, you said what you said, but nah, mate, we're just going to go ahead and tell you that actually you can't say that Rwanda is not a safe country because I deem that it is, against all evidence. I mean, Francis, what does the world make of it when a country which has significant democratic issues like Rwanda is turning around and saying to the UK, if you don't follow international law, the deal's off because this is too much even for us.
Well, frankly, the whole thing is batshit crazy. It's another Tory catfight. It's Sunak trying to placate his right because he's terrified of Suella Braverman, and he's also terrified of Reform UK. He thinks they're going to split the Tory vote at the next election. He's trying to find a. It's all like Theresa May with the Brexit deal that everybody hated, an attempt to try and pull all of the Conservative Party together. She only succeeded in ending her own term in office in the end because everybody hated it. And I think this looks astonishingly similar and ended in a similar way. But what bothers me is this idea that the whole of the UK suddenly somehow is obsessed with immigration, with small boats migration. That's not what I'm hearing, and I doubt if it's what Maureen's hearing either. What bothers people of the UK is 13 years of Tory incompetence, and this just looks like more of it.
I mean, it's staggering, isn't it? I mean, the hundreds of millions of pounds being sent to Rwanda for nothing so far, and now I think that they're saying that they would only take 200 people, poor souls, anyway. I mean, it's. I mean, I think the phrase "batshit crazy," Francis, is probably very appropriate. But I mean, in terms of the how do you create I mean, how does a serious politician create a policy that is as flawed as this and expect us just to go, oh yeah, that's a great idea? I mean, what's going on with Rishi Sunak, and will his prime ministership be forever tarnished by this? Maureen.
Well, it'll be finished by this and other complete mishandling of the economy, as Francis says, for the last 13 years. I mean, clearly, it is Rishi Sunak and the Tories trying to hang on by their fingernails to power and cling to power because having power is the most important thing for Tories, regardless of whether they make a good fist of the economy and running the country or not. I mean, I heard one KC saying that literally this is the UK government trying to argue that a cat is a dog, when clearly a dog is not a cat. And as has been said, this is clearly politicians interfering in the judicial system in the there isn't a UK judicial system, but interfering in the judicial system. And that is a very dangerous situation for any country to be in. If it was happening elsewhere, we'd be crying it out. And it just shows the desperation of the Tories, as I say, to cling on to power.
I mean, there is an increasing authoritarianism happening within the Tory party. I mean, I've, for a number of years, increasingly been concerned that we're sort of, as I've sometimes have said, we're in the foothills of fascism, and it doesn't seem that is an extreme position to be taking, because that's when elected governments start trying to tear down the independence of the judiciary. That seems to me to be a sort of fairly significant first step towards authoritarianism. But the other thing, Francis, is I mean, that's bad enough. The fact that there wasn't a small boat crisis before the legal routes were we should remember that there used to be legal routes by which people could make an asylum claim and then come to this country. 51% of all asylum claims of people that finally do make it this country are upheld, and I think the majority of appeals are as well. So it's people coming here have a right often to be here. What I don't understand is why it is we've got to a point where this seems to be the overarching sort of post-Brexit issue for the Tory party, or is it just othering and distraction so that they can point a finger and say, there's 200 desperate souls in a dinghy. They're the reason why your children can't go to school and see a doctor and have a house. It's not because we've been privatizing everything and selling everything off and not building homes that are fit for human habitation. I mean, where do we go from here within a UK context?
It's absolutely about othering and distraction. In fact, that's all this government is doing now. And it's not just this. There are other things as well, where it's pointing to culture war rather than dealing with things that the British people are really concerned about on the ground, which is we can't get a GP appointment, we can't get housing, we can't, and very high rents, very high mortgages, the rising cost of food, all sorts of things, a collapse of public services, A&E, ambulances, NHS waiting lists. These are the things that from what I've seen, the British people are concerned about. And there is an element of the government trying to point to migrants and say, oh, it's all because of them, rather than because it hasn't actually got any policies at all for dealing with any of this. And what bothers me most of all is that some of this appears to have infected the Labour Party as well. I would like to see some actual policies from the Labour Party to deal with these issues, and to pull the attention away from the culture wars and the small boats.
I mean, the Tory party seems to have shifted so far to the far right. I mean, it's not it's not just me saying that. I mean, when Maloney was campaigning in Italy, the far right leader, they were basically saying how great it was in the UK because they had another far right parliament there. So I mean, it's across the world, people are looking at the UK and going, "Oh, look, there's a far right government in power." And it seems as though sort of Labour is now occupying the centre, right? So, I mean, in Scotland, obviously, we've got the SNP and we've got the Greens as left of centre parties. But in England, there doesn't seem to be a left of centre party anymore, apart from the Greens. I was sharing something today. It's the OK Doomer website. You aren't the one panicking, they are. And it's 10 reasons why societies fail to respond to their greatest threats. And it's actually really interesting looking at issues like the ways in which governments kind of gaslight people into behaving, and habituation, getting people used to living in misery, so that they're so used to the misery that they kind of don't want to shift out of it because they're so numbed by the misery of it all, which is kind of, you would almost imagine, is like the point of food banks and impoverishing people. I mean, Maureen, is this, as we move on to the next story, I mean, the Scottish Government has published its Social Security in an Independent Scotland paper this week, and next week we'll see the launch of its Minimum Income Guarantee paper, with many of the issues causing the cost of living crisis in Scotland reserved to Westminster. What can the devolved Scottish Government do now? I mean, Maureen, is the Scottish Government robust enough to be able to break people out of this kind of paralyzed sort of state that many people are in because of this habituated misery and the kind of the constant chaos that's being hit at us? Do you think that people are going to see it for what it is and be able to kind of get that momentum behind us to move towards an independent Scotland? Do you think that these papers that the Scottish Government is producing about how an independent Scotland could have an economy and a society like normal small nations in, for example, the Nordic states? And do you think that will then become a realistic mandate that people will be drawn to, sort of, if they can sort of see an alternative to the misery of life under Westminster rule?
Well, I think the fact that those in favour of independence is around 54% in recent polls shows that a majority of people do think that there is an alternative way of doing things. But currently, austerity is so bad and affecting the Scottish Government's ability to do things that it wants, that it's very difficult to show that there is a different way. I mean, I keep saying that austerity is an economic choice has been for the Tories for the past 13 years. And remember, they were in coalition with the Lib Dems right at the beginning that David Cameron introduced austerity. And the fact that Labour are And they have moved further to the right. I mean, why they're being pulled by the right, and people think that the right are going to be the salvation of their ills. As Francis said, I don't think they are, but the media are in cahoots with the government on this. And why Keir Starmer thinks that he needs to move to the right when actually, you should be offering a real difference and a real alternative in so many things rather than trying to fight in that middle ground. I think people both north and south of the border are crying out for something different. And we have seen in other countries, like in EU countries and the States, where having a massive injection of capital into the country can get away from austerity and have a different. Although perhaps Francis will correct my economics on this, but it is difficult for the Scottish Government to show that it has a clearly different path, and it'll be interesting to see how all these really good papers can be distilled down into sellable points on the doorstep in the coming election.
I mean, Francis, you know what you're looking at better than I do, I am sure. I mean, to me, it all looks feasible and really positive and very attractive. Sort of, an independent Scotland's sort of a progressive means of looking after the poorest in society and sort of trying to raise everybody up so that everybody has got a decent standard of living. I mean, other countries can do it. Do you think that this is a realistic prospect for Scotland? And what is your take on the kind of the fiscal competency behind these proposals?
It's totally realistic for an independent Scotland. I rather liked this set of proposals, and importantly for me, it actually addresses really the problems with the current situation, which is that after 13 years of Tory austerity, we've got a very shredded social security system that doesn't support people when they're in time of trouble, which is what the social security system was always intended to do. So for me, these proposals actually, in a way, brought the social security system back towards what it was always intended to be, and that would be very welcome. And for any advanced country, it's perfectly affordable, and I see no reason why Scotland wouldn't be able to do it. Where we are now, of course, is that Scotland isn't independent, and so Scotland is constrained by the fiscal rules of the UK government. So what I would like to see, therefore, is the UK government looking at proposals like this to reform the social security system that the Conservatives have wrecked and try and restore it back towards what it should be doing.
But that would assume that you had a UK government that actually wanted to stop people from suffering.
Indeed. So it's not going to be this one. And I don't know at the moment whether it would be a Labour one. And I have to say the mood music doesn't look good, but maybe things will change.
I love that optimism to end a programme on. I mean, Maureen, how do we get these messages out? The Scottish Government is publishing a number of independent papers. We've got 30 seconds left for you to give me a comment. What can we do to get these conversations going in ways that are actually sensible?
Out on the doorstep, tapping on doors. We've got to bypass the mainstream media, as the SNP has always done. It's still a mass membership party. It still has more members than all the other parties in Scotland combined. And we've got to make sure that we can mobilise that huge resource to be out speaking on the doorsteps. As you know, I've said in previous programmes there, my local SNP is out, but people, increasingly I direct people to websites like Believe in Scotland and Business for Scotland, who have got a vast amount of information on there as to why and how Scotland should be an independent country.
Well, that's it for this week's Full Scottish. Before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. Our programmes, our need to reach our £30,000 target to pay our bills is still pressing. However, the generosity of our supporters has given us a little more time. We have raised over 22,000 and we have been able to continue making programmes until now, but we do need to raise the remaining £8,000 immediately. So if anybody knows anyone with a few pounds spare to chuck us, please do. Thank you again to my guests, Frances Coppola and Maureen Watt. My name's Ruth Watson. I've been wearing, you may have noticed, this fabulous Witches of Scotland hoodie. It's quite appropriate for those who know me. This is Quarrelsome Doom. That's one of the... It's one of the crimes that a woman could commit that could have seen them done as a witch. So obviously that's just nonsense. So the Witches for Scotland campaign is a campaign for justice for the women murdered following accusations of witchcraft. Of course, the echoes of history still affect the way society treats women today. So if you're interested in this fabulous hoodie and more, check out the campaign. My name's Ruth Watson. Thank you for joining me.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Lewis McGlynn.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Saoirse Healy.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Donald C. Stewart. Broadcasting Scotland is Scotland's independent broadcaster, providing factual news, reporting on the issues important to the people of Scotland.
We are committed to public service broadcasting, and with your support, we will produce even more programmes.
Provide opportunities for young people interested in media production and broadcasting, and challenge preconceptions of what Scottish media looks like, amplifying Scotland's voice and reflecting its communities.
We can already deliver high-quality live news, and we will create the highest quality programmes for you to enjoy. But we can only do that with your support.
So please subscribe to and share our channel or donate to Broadcasting Scotland via the link in the description. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.